Okay, so this is actually a pretty challenging title. We heard yesterday about all the complexity in thinking about ecosystem services, and especially when we're thinking about it in a multifunctional way. And so when we think about advising farmers and science stakeholders, we really have to be cautious about how we give information. So what I thought I'd start with was advise. What exactly does it mean? And I want to talk about some experiences from my work in California. I've always had a position where I'm 70% professor and 30% extension specialist. There's only 3 people other than that, besides me, at University of California, but throughout my career I've had to mix. And I want to talk about some of the things I've learned. And then I want to talk about some conceptual thoughts about how we get started on advising about multifunctional benefits in ecosystem services. And then a little bit about the fact that as ecologists, even us as biophysical scientists, I think we love the thought that there's cultural ecosystem services involved in the work we do, but we often lose the ability to integrate that. We're not even sure exactly how to do that. Okay, so the dictionary, that's where I started with this tough topic. And I realized in the dictionary, advise could be both a transitive verb and an intransitive verb. So a transitive verb is one that requires an object to receive the action. So in this case, the dictionary says that we would give someone a recommendation about what should be done. In the intransitive verb, we give a recommendation about what should be done. It's not to someone who's directly receiving the information. And I thought, well, is this interesting in our context or not? And I think it is. I think it's really different when we're dealing with the transitive verb, where we're dealing with people directly. And so I tried to make a list of my general impressions of how we would operate in a more direct information to people, especially farmers and stakeholders in the agricultural landscape. So for example, we'd be more geared towards information for specific crops or farms, and thinking multifunctionally, a lot of diverse types of information. Participatory action research is probably important because we don't have the answers. We're still figuring them out. Those actions have to be spatially explicit, geared to different parts of the landscape or different types of farms. We might have to focus more on concrete trade-offs of decisions. The kinds of scenario building that we do might be very locally related. The kinds of interactions, at least in my experience with this type of work, is it's land-based stakeholders, and there's often long-term relationships. These are people who have lived and worked on the land for a long time. There's a willingness to do adaptive management step by step. Co-learning and knowledge co-production is something we're often aiming for. Whereas when we use our research to make a recommendation in a general sense about what should be done, we often are thinking of a more widespread information distribution. We might be working more with databases, GIS, and models with concrete, exact locations in the landscape. The actions are more open-ended. We might be really geared to certain policies, as we heard yesterday. Our scenario building tends to be more regional, and we are more focused on integrating hierarchies in the academic and in the policy world, rather than having long-term relationships within a landscape. So that there's all sorts of evolving old and new relationships as people move in and out of this more generic type of knowledge sharing. this knowledge sharing can often be top down. And I think as ecologists, we have to be careful about being very top down. So as I pursued this idea, and I don't even know if it's correct or not, I'd love to have some discussion about it, I asked the question, is it possible to effectively combine these two types of advising approaches? One is very directed towards certain people, and the other is more recommendation based in a larger sense. And they thought, yes, there should be a way that we can do this. I'm going to give you some examples that aren't perfect, but I think that when we do our research on the ground directed towards certain people or groups of people with them directly receiving and responding, we can learn something that then can be upscaled to a set of recommendations that might be more useful to society at large. So I'm going to tell you about the place where I've worked for many years, Yolo County, California. It's in the Central Valley of California. In the valley, there's commodity agriculture with a lot of crops like safflower and tomatoes. The hills have cattle ranching. The mountains have savanna and oak woodland. It's actually one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. The river that runs along the east side of the county goes into the San Francisco Bay. And so all the pollutants or fertilizer residues that move out of the county go into the estuaries of this very important delta area. Something that I really think's helped the kind of agricultural landscape research I've done is that this is the county where Davis is located. UC Davis is right there. There's a pretty developed social ecological network with farmers, farm bureaus, government agencies, NGOs, and the state capital is only 20 kilometers away. So we're often the poster child for what happens in agriculture. And so I'm going to give you some examples of research, and I'm not going to tell you about the research results so much, but more about the approaches that we've taken in 3 landscape studies. One is organic tomato farms across a landscape. So this is the main central part of Yolo County, and we had 13 organic farms for tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, and we picked the farms in a representative way to get different market types, fresh market and processing, different types of crop diversification, farmers markets versus big corporate type farmers, and wanted to figure out how people differed in their agri-ecosystem and management, and then in a very detailed fashion looked at plant-soil microbe interactions on all these different farms and tried to find out how different people were dealing with the question of supplying enough nitrogen, which is tough in organic farms, building soil carbon, so that's an ecosystem service too, and also getting to reliable yields. And I would call this an exploratory approach because we didn't know the answers beforehand. We weren't advising like we knew what to tell people. We had to have these farmers and their information exchanging with us to get enough data together to understand the processes. And one of the main outcomes is something that we call tightly coupled plant-soil nitrogen cycling, where we get very rapid turnover of nitrogen by the microbial biomass. We can see that with N15 studies, but very low ammonium and nitrate pools, but plenty of nitrogen in the crop. This is a result of very fine-tuned nutrient cycling that supplies into the crop without leaching and resulting in nitrous oxide production, was associated with higher soil carbon and higher plant yields. And the way people got there was usually by using a number of different types of inputs into their soil, of organic amendments or different kinds of soluble fertilizers. They didn't all do it the same way. What we found was the soil management that achieved this wasn't related to farm level factors at all. It wasn't like the the richest farmers or the farmers market farmers. It was how these people had learned to manage their soil. And so we came up with an answer that could be spread out over the wider landscape to conventional farmers as well. And so this is kind of a traditional advising type approach, where you're working with the farming community. There's opportunities for meetings. We had a lot of one-on-one meetings. There's webinars. And it could fit into this framework of advising, but it was different, and it was based by this exchange of information. The next study I want to tell you about is one that moved slightly to the west of the county, and you can see on the map on the left-hand side, left, is the savanna and oak woodland, and then it moves into this very intensive agriculture to the east. And what we were looking at was waterways next to fields. And so what we'd measure is 1 meter from the waterway, 10 meters from the waterway, and 50 meters for the waterway. We used a GIS approach to get a very representative sample of the waterways in this part of the county. I'm not going to tell you how we did it, but we had 60 sampling sites. We had the landscape clustered into these different types. Why am I emphasizing that? Because I want to say this is what I would call more of an assessment approach. We went out there, we weren't directly working with farmers. We'd call people up and say, we're from University of California, can we sample on your land? Only 2 farmers said that we couldn't. But most of the people weren't that interested in the results. We had an agricultural intensification index that we got partly from knowing something about their farming practices. What I found in general is that farmers are much more interested in what really affects their production. And while they were willing to be part of this, the people who really had the uptake were from different agencies like the Resource Conservation Service, the Audubon Society, NGOs that were interested in environmental quality. And, well, actually, one of the main findings is we went from what was really the biodiversity hotspot in the mountains down into the intensive ag, as might be expected. The biodiversity, soil quality, and riparian health decreased. And loss of trees in the waterways was a really important thing. So in this study, we looked at both soil biodiversity and plant biodiversity. The third example is one where I would say our goal was to look at what might be called a climate change assessment approach, going to a more response approach. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but California has one of the most stringent greenhouse gas emissions policies probably in the world. We now plan to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. And so as part of this, there was a big research program paid for by the state of California. This was a 6-year project that I was in charge of. The state said, pick a jurisdiction, pick somewhere to do a case study. And I picked Yolo County because I knew the farmers, I knew the situation, I knew the stakeholders. So this is an example of how maybe we can go from the transitive verb where you're starting out working directly with people to give them something. And then because of that framework that's built, can move on to something that might be more useful at a larger scale, the state level. You can read the whole list of projects that were done. Some were specified directly by the state. Others we kind of came to as this whole thing evolved. There were quite a few participants, mainly from UC Davis and SEI. And what has happened now over the last few years is the main science policy outcome from this has been for farmland preservation. We found in this study that the agricultural irrigated cropland part of the county emitted 70 times less greenhouse gas emissions in terms of CO2 equivalents than the urban industrial part of the county. And this was a fact that the state moved on. It was an easy number to use, And as a result, even this year, we have $40 million being put towards farmland preservation. Unfortunately, they didn't look at the fine-tuned complexities of the whole thing that much. More of that's coming. That last thing on the model of the urban growth scenarios and the greenhouse gas emissions was much more about the type of infill growth could even further benefit this. What's interesting is there's been less policy outcomes on the stuff about agricultural adaptation and food security, which you can see involves 1, 2, 3 of the first 3 of these things. Why not? I'd be glad to talk about that, what I think, but it's a little disappointing in some ways that it went to the more larger land use outcome. Something else I want to say about this is that I feel I was quite strict about as a project leader is all these things have been published. The first place it was published is in the government document. It's about 180 pages long. But I thought it was really important that all the scientists got scientific publications out of this, because otherwise then nobody wants to participate the next time. So that was a part of this that I think is really important. The science policy interface, and I think that you talked about that last time, is the fact that we need these policy briefs coming out of the research that we're doing in order to keep both sides of the thing going. Okay, so just drivers from ecosystem service advising. I asked myself as part of this, okay, so what really drives the need for advising about ecosystem services? And this is from my California experience. I'm not sure it's the same here. I would say the #1 thing is a government policy, either one that was about to happen in terms of possible legislation or one that's being implemented. That's where we really get the incentives to have advising go out to different stakeholders. Civil society is also really important. In the work I've done, I found like civil society is so important for getting out the messages that we produce. As scientists, we really can't streamline them in quite as simple of way. And that includes things like the Farmers Guilds, the Farm Bureau, the natural resource related NGOs. And some of the NGOs we're working with are keeping us informed about the new policy changes that are happening and inviting us to come speak at hearings. So there's plenty of ways to be involved without having to be a direct advocate for that civil society agency. The research community that supports agronomic and agroecological approaches to studying ecological functions, novel sets of practices. I've been so disappointed in my career about the lack of real motivation and impetus within the research community to get the information out. Maybe that's different here. Okay, so the last bit of this is about conceptual thoughts and steps forward. And I want to talk about these 2 items by starting with this. This is a nice diagram about landscape multifunctionality going from low to high heterogeneity within the landscape. It talks about these different connections between production and recipients of ecosystem services. And the question is, how many of us in research can really take on this multifunctional approach? We keep being given it as a goal, but I think that we have to think of it more as entry points. You can see in the middle of the diagram are a number of things: field margins, focus areas, wetland creation. I think most of us come into this as an entry point, and we have to keep our minds open for how we, in our situation, become more multifunctional. But we really are trained in a disciplinary fashion. So when we look at something like this in a recent paper looking at design goals for agricultural landscapes, and you can see going from very intensive to more supposedly intensified sustainably landscapes. The author has listed the different types of ecosystem services that would be present in these landscapes. And I think that that, you know, it all makes sense, but the one that we have the least real information for is the cultural services. We have a lot more on supporting, provisioning, and regulating services. And it's an almost assumption here that the cultural services go hand in hand. Excuse me. What do you do with cultural services? Okay, I'll show you a diagram in a second. Cultural services, as defined in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, are the benefits that people obtain from recreation, from well-being, mental well-being, maybe even some spirituality. I think that this is a really dangerous assumption. I think we need to learn really a lot more about cultural ecosystem services before anything like a design phase is possible. I don't think we can design landscapes right now. I think we're lucky if we can even measure things in them in a representative way. And now I want to go to the idea of how do you advise when there's a lack of information? And let's go to, first of all, what the original definition of ecosystem services was, and then how it's evolved through the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So it's really about the conditions and processes by which natural ecosystems and the species in them sustain and fulfill human life. What's happened through time is we've gotten much more towards what people obtain. It's provision, obtained benefits, valuation. And we have lots less information on how we transform situations, who do we enable, and what do we advise. And so if you read this diagram out of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, you can see these words. It's this idea that these ecosystem services are flowing out, and it's about studying the provision of them, including the cultural ones, non-material benefits. And some people are starting to think more about how do we engage farmers in the landscape so that we involve more of the cultural issues, more of the motivation for change. And I put these up here so these references might be interesting to you. One is that's described as a social ecological system strand. Another one is more towards mental health, development, and psychology, and how community bonds make ecosystem services possible in different situations. Another idea is that it's basic human values, that people who are farmers or landowners are geared towards stewardship. In fact, there's a large spiritual basis for this. A lot of the world's religions say, you know, it's in giving that we receive, or it's the generosity that we put out there that brings us joy and happiness. But is that enough to convince a landowner or farmer that it's on their watch, it's on their personal investment that we're going to see stewardship happen? And so I just want to end with this by saying that as time has moved on since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we've seen that ecosystem service research has included a much larger human dimension by some of the things that I've listed there. But the worry I have in advising, and you know, whether it's all these different forms that we've tried through time, is that we're talking about people on the land having to give a tremendous amount of themselves. They have to switch practices, they have to take risks, and it's all under the guise of benefits to the public good. And I think that we really have to understand why people want to do this, and I think it has a lot to do with cultural services. I think that give-take relationships, where we put much more on what people have to give in order to get ecosystem services, is going to be important. So really what I think our challenge is putting together these collaborative processes for major transformative options, not just one at a time, but maybe with an entry point one at a time, and helping farmers face the risk and uncertainty along with that. So I want to thank you for listening to these ideas that I've tried to form for the workshop, allowing me to participate, sharing your ideas, and also thinking a little bit about this cartoon that you might have seen before, in which the advising older, wiser beaver is telling the young one, you start, sure kid, you start by working for the ecosystem, but pretty soon you figure out how to get the ecosystem working for you. So what do we do to get the farmers enabled to be able to put that thought, effort, and work into the ecosystem to get the ecosystem services we all benefit from? Thank you.
Any question for Louisa?
Maybe I've gone over time.
You have, but okay. One question? Yeah.
Thank you for a very, very nice talk.
Thank you.
I still would like to ask a sort of provocative question. When thinking about landscape, it's a lot about public value, sustainability, future generations. So I wondered, to what extent are we as researchers actually trapped in a sort of neoliberal agenda, where we think that all the change has to be due to voluntary actions by farmers realizing the great benefits to society, instead of old-fashioned rules and regulations, taxes and prohibitions?
That's exactly what I've been facing through these years of working on a landscape with the same people year in and year out, more than 20 years in this landscape, is that it's, I would agree with what you're saying, is that we've not really thought enough about how we are actually telling people that, you know, you take on the risks, you do this for the rest of us, and not really enabling them with the ability to do so.